You watch us in America, good morning. In Asia, good evening. My name is Laszlo Ander. I'm the Secretary General of FEPS, the Foundation for Progressive European Studies in Brussels, and I will be your moderator this afternoon with a title, A Fair Post-COVID World. This is part of the Global Progressive Forum 2021 under the umbrella title of UNitedFor a People-Powered Recovery. As the world slowly and unevenly transitions to a post-pandemic future, this session will bring together different global perspectives on how this future can be fairer and more inclusive. Featuring a number of high-level participants from across the world, the discussion will focus on challenges involved in achieving a post-COVID recovery, which will also bring us closer to social justice, and also the need for a forward-looking progressive response. Let me introduce quickly the participants of this high-level panel. First, we will start with Guy Ryder, the Director General of the International Labour Organization, the ILO. Helen Clark, the former UNDP administration head, will follow former Prime Minister of New Zealand. Then we will have Camilla Brückner with me in the studio in the European Parliament building, the representative of the United Nations Secretary General to the EU and the director of the UN office in Brussels. She will be followed by Howard Lee Chuan Hao, the former State Youth and Sports Minister for the state of Perak, Malaysia, former UC President and a State Legislative Assembly person for Perak State in Malaysia. Merav Michaeli, Minister of Transport and Road Safety from Israel, will also join us. She is the leader of the Labour Party in Israel. And last but not least, we will also have Arantxa González Leia, former Minister of Foreign Affairs, European Union and Cooperation from Spain. Welcome you all to this conversation. I very much look forward to the interventions. And I believe that starting with a video message from the head of the ILO from Geneva is indeed very appropriate because COVID-19 has disrupted the lives and livelihoods of billions of workers. And it has turned the spotlight on weak labor rights, insufficient social protection in many places across the world. As economies slowly and unevenly reopen after the pandemic, I believe the question is how can we make sure we took the right lessons from the crisis? And we also need to ask, what do we need to do to ensure a fair recovery, how it can be made possible, and how a new social contract can be developed. Let's listen to the message from Guy Ryder.
Colleagues, dear friends, the pandemic is continuing to have tremendous impacts on employment across the globe. The ILO's latest estimates show that at a global level, labour market recovery from the pandemic has stalled in 2021. The number of hours worked in the world remains significantly below its pre-pandemic level by a margin of the equivalent of 125 million full-time jobs, and it's now flatlining. And the damage has been unequal. Employment has declined more for women, youth, and medium and low-skilled workers, with major differences also across sectors. Prospects for labour market recovery remain uneven and uncertain in the face of supply chain disruptions, energy price spikes, inflation worries, and debt distress. And the COVID-19 crisis has been a dramatic setback to sustainable development for a world which was already badly off track in its pursuit of the United Nations Sustainable Development Goals. There is a great divergence between the recovery paths of higher and of lower income countries. And this is linked closely to the availability of financial resources for fiscal stimulus and to the availability of vaccines. This is not building back better. We are leaving many countries and millions of people behind. Colleagues, as good a measure as any of our success in building back better will be the extent to which our policies contribute better than before to realising the UN 2030 agenda. A recovery that returns us to a pre-pandemic trajectory would be clearly insufficient. We need global solutions to the global challenges we face, and we need to include working people in that response. For its part, the ILO adopted in June a global call to action for a human-centred recovery, proposing a series of measures that invest in people, their skills, their health, their social protection, and that leaves no one behind. And at the UN General Assembly this year, the Secretary General launched a global accelerator for jobs and social protection that is designed to do just this. It aims to channel national and international, public and private financial flows to social protection floors, the creation of decent jobs, and the process of a just transition to carbon neutrality, the importance of which we understand all too clearly as we emerge from COP26. Your strong support for this UN Global Accelerator would help all countries to realise these objectives. All of this to foster a recovery that is inclusive, sustainable and resilient, very much in line with the objectives of the Global Progressive Forum.
Ladies and gentlemen, let me thank Guy Ryder for this message. I believe he explained with no ambiguity what is at stake at this stage at the post-COVID global recovery. And that gives me an excellent opportunity to invite Helen Clark into the conversation, especially focusing on global preparedness and the need for a coordinated response. I'm putting these questions into the center because we do have the impression that the actions of various states remained fragmented and uneven, even at this fourth wave of the COVID-19 crisis. So, Ms. Helen Clark, my question is, how would you see the role of progressives, how progressives in different parts of the world could come together in order to address this situation? What could be one or two key political or policy pathways to do so?
Thank you. And I think there's two key pathways I'll highlight, while agreeing with everything that Guy Ryder said about the inclusive human-centred recovery at the national level. Firstly, progressives need to come together to argue for vaccine equity. We're facing now a rollout scenario with vaccines which would see much of Africa not reached until 2023. Now, we know that none of us are safe until all of us are safe. We are protracting this pandemic with the uneven and inequitable rollout. And I would say to progressives in high-income countries, whether you're in governments or in parliament as opposition members of parliament, whether you're in the professions, academia, NGOs, just keep raising your voice for your governments to do the right thing. High-income countries ordered twice as many doses of vaccines as they needed. They've been sitting on them, they've been hoarding them, sometimes discarding them when the shelf life's gone, when countries in the global south are desperate for them. This is ridiculous. We need scaled up manufacturing, and the countries where the major companies are headquartered need to be putting pressure on to get manufacturing out to the global south. And as well, of course, there's the TRIPS waiver, the trade-related intellectual properties agreement of WTO, which should kick in to make goods required to fight the pandemic, like therapeutics and vaccines, readily available. Second point that progressives need to raise their voices on, we need a strengthened multilateral system. It's not just about WHO, it needs strengthening too. But we need a new global architecture. We need a global oversight council that's going to keep political momentum and mobilization around the awareness of pandemic preparedness and response. The independent panel that I co-chaired for the World Health Assembly was very, very strong on this. We need a dedicated financing mechanism based on ability to pay and going to those who require support for preparedness and response. We need new legal instruments, a new pandemic treaty, revised international health regulations. We need a global public goods model designed for the future for allocating goods needed to fight pandemics like vaccines and therapeutics. And we need to empower the WHO, which doesn't, as it stands, have the power to automatically access the site of an outbreak, to publish information that it has, not really empowered to act in a precautionary fashion when it sees a pandemic coming down the track. There's so much to do, and we really count on progressive voices raising these issues of equity and of strengthening the multilateral system for responses. We could make this the last pandemic. If we don't act now, we are doomed to repeat this rather sad lesson of history. Thank you.
Came through in excellent quality from New Zealand, and stressing the importance of a stronger multilateral coordination indeed is something which we'll continue to speak about. I would like to now turn to Camilla Brückner, who is with me in the studio. She represents the UN Secretary General in Brussels, and maybe that's why I would like to start with a quote from Antonio Guterres, who said the following: "We are at an inflection point in history. The COVID-19 pandemic has served as a wake-up call, and with the climate crisis now looming, the world is experiencing its biggest shared test since Second World War." We know about the UN's Our Common Agenda, which sets a path to tackle future challenges, but there are many who fear that the political will by several states is not there to implement it at this moment. From a UN perspective, what do you think is necessary to be done in order to secure a future with shared and sustainable prosperity for people and our planet?
Well, thank you, first of all, very much for letting me participate. And indeed, as you said, and as the SG has said, this is an inflection point in history. As remarked by him, we are facing two opposed scenarios. One where we'll continue business as usual and ignore the warning signs we have so clearly: climate, disasters, inequality, social upheaval, and etc. But we also have another scenario where we can implement the solutions that we already know exist, but where we need now the political commitment that our leaders have already taken in 2015, and using this opportunity to build a fairer and greener world. So the SG's Our Common Agenda report, which was drafted at the request of the member states, and after very extensive consultation, has presented some solutions or some recommendations on how to go forward. And it basically concludes that we do not need to reinvent the wheel. We have the existing tools and finance, and now need to accelerate action to implement existing agreements. And in order to do this, the SG has proposed a series of very punctual actions to be undertaken by the UN and the UN member states and all its partners. And the recommendations, if I can just quickly outline those for the purpose of those who may not know the Common Agenda, can be grouped into four broad areas. They call on renewed solidarity between peoples and future generations. It calls for a new social contract anchored in human rights. It calls for better management of critical issues of global concerns, just as like Helen Clark just mentioned, for peace, the economy, health, and our planet. And finally, also calls for United Nations that is upgraded so it can meet the challenges of a new era. I think we are in a place where multilateral systems are no longer just a means to an end, but it's also an end in itself if we are to achieve these things. So we already have a roadmap in place and the Sustainable Development Goals and with the Paris Agreement. But we know that progress in achieving the SDGs is already off track, as Ryder also mentioned, and the pandemic has set us even further back. So the report that the Secretary General launched recently, and which was very well received by its member states, aims to turbocharge the work on the Sustainable Development Goals so that we can accelerate throughout the decade and taking into account the gaps and the delays caused by the pandemic.
Thank you very much, especially for highlighting the central role of the Sustainable Development Goals. I think this is music to the ears of many of us in Brussels and especially in the European Parliament. And you also highlighted a generational dimension.
Absolutely.
And I think this connects very well with our next speaker, who became known as a youth leader, Howard Lee Chuan Hao. You are with us, connecting from Malaysia, and we would like to hear your views, especially from the perspective of the disruption that has been caused by the pandemic and the devastating consequences in various parts of the world. As we know, this pandemic has deeply affected the quality of democracy, democratic freedoms in various countries, including Europe, but also in Asia and elsewhere. Coming from Malaysia, what is your take on how progressive forces can address this situation?
Thank you. Thank you for inviting me. I feel positively dwarfed by the panel in comparison to myself. I'm quite glad that you mentioned that Malaysia, or many countries actually, especially in this region, has suffered many democratic rollback. But I think in this particular context, even without the pandemic, democracy is sadly one of these things that is a double-edged sword that often kind of cuts both ways. It's not the most perfect way of handling a civilization, but it's the only way that we have, and it's the only way that we must proceed. But especially in the country where I'm from, as the world was going through, hell and hellfire, trying to deal with saving lives and livelihoods, a series of political coups d'etats took place, spearheaded by a group of selfish politicians just to gain power as people basically losing the will to live, with or without the virus. And as a result of that, we've had basically extremely bad governance, almost no governance, increase in corruption, and many lives have been lost unnecessarily. But I do wish, as we have extremely high calibered speakers here, I wish not to repeat things that others will speak of, but I want to bring a few things that would represent the needs and wants and desperations of the youths. I want to narrow it down to 4 key areas and 4 key things. And I think people would understand why I want to bring it down, because maybe these things are not necessary. I come from a region called ASEAN, which Malaysia is part of. And when we speak of a just transition into a post-COVID world, we're also talking about a huge swathe, a proportion of the global population that will be highly affected. And here in ASEAN, I mean, just to give you some context, COVID-19 has devastated employees and workers. In 2020, 8.4% of working hours, 10.6 million jobs, 7.8% of labor income were lost, wiped out. And in Malaysia, which is part of the middle income bloc of countries, which includes 75% of the world's population, but actually only represents only 1/3 of the global GDP. And middle-income countries face diverse challenges of achieving the SDGs, as we have mentioned several times. And this will include shortfalls in digital infrastructure, food, essential medicines, and training. And I'll lump it down to I would say 3 key areas of challenges. Number one, we face training skills and basically a crisis of training skills and education, bringing on maybe not just 1, but 2 lost generations. Number 2, economic crises that I think we are seeing with our own eyes. I want to tell you many stories, but we don't have time for that. And at the end, what we started with a democratic crisis. Now, the 4 key things that I think may not sound very macro, but done in a micro way will bring macro consequences. And number 1, I call for each and every single one of us, nations, states, individuals, NGOs, and CSOs, to support and build the digital resilience of medium, small, and micro enterprises, and inculcate a culture of local content and supply chains that contribute to decent jobs and economic growth, in line with SDG 12, one of my favorites, which is responsible production and consumption. The second one, how can I put it? I'd like to call for the initiation, per se, of a just and equitable upskilling and broadening of skills development, lifelong learning, and other active labor market policies, and more importantly, a decommercialization and deprofiteering of technical and vocational training to facilitate successful labor market, and in ensuring it is a needs and demand-based agenda by designing and working with employers, right? A lot of people profiteer from education and training. We must stop that. I'm not saying tone it down, we must stop it. The third one is, now this is going to sound very controversial, well-established multilateral organizations and their member states, however imperfect, like the European Union, must engage directly and cooperate to take joint actions with civil society organizations, with NGOs, and with elected officials. Now, controversial here, especially those who are not in government. In countries like Malaysia, who have suffered from huge democratic setbacks, to take proactive, bold, and innovative actions to fill the policy voids that incompetent and undemocratically established governments are unable to fill. And lastly, and something that to me is extremely, extremely important, is to address the increasing disillusionment and distrust towards not just politics, not just politicians, but a gross mistrust and distrust towards democracy as a result of those who have opportunistically assaulted democratic institutions, using the pandemic as a disguise. I'd like to encourage or ask your help, everyone's here's help, to encourage SDG-centric mediation and facilitation between political forces, left and right and center, and even non-ideological political forces in victim nations like Malaysia through all channels possible, with the end game being to break down traditional political walls that have hindered cooperation for the greater good, to build back democracy better, based on resetting, reconciling, and refocusing on the needs of the people, of the planet, by working towards achieving the SDGs. Now, if we can do these 4 things and focus on the 3 key crises that, from a youth point of view and from a ASEAN point of view, I think we'll make great headways towards the SDGs.
Thank you. That was a very clear list, and particularly interesting for me when you spoke about skills and training. I used to be responsible for the European Social Fund, and indeed that's a great instrument to deliver what you explained, to ensure that skills and innovation, the competitiveness of the entire workforce is seen as a public good. And it's an important investment in human resources, human capital, without indeed the dominance of private profiteering. But the next speaker, Merav Michaeli, is I think with us, and we would need to go back to the question of democracy and its resilience, because indeed the COVID-19 pandemic has posed a great challenge in this field. Human rights, at stake in many parts of the world. How can this fight against the pandemic be combined with the fight for human rights and for upholding and even deepening democratic values?
Good afternoon, everyone, and it's a pleasure being here in this very important discussion. So I think maybe the most important bottom line from COVID as far as lessons go is that I think it reminded everyone that the state matters. The state can and needs to take care of its people. That not everything can be privatized, and that we need each other, and we need social equality, social democracy, and social policies in order to go through difficult things in life. And actually, this for me is the basis for restoring democracy, because if we look back and examine what made it possible for the relatively brief golden age of post-World War II, where we established a strong democracy in Europe and in the US and in Israel also. What happened to us as progressives is that we were under the impression that we can go beyond social democracy and focus more on identity politics. That became the focus of our democratic fights and struggles. And I think today, more than ever, it's clear that the number one thing that allowed the golden age of democracy was that people had personal and private existential security. Financially, economically, the fact that they knew they had a kind of contract with society and with the state, that if they do their best to handle their fears and their anxieties, then certainly they will have a job with a dignified salary to live on. They will have future for their children. They will have a house to live in. They will be able to provide good education with prospect for their offsprings. This is all almost gone, or in many places it is gone. And when people do not have this basic, this very, very basic existential security, it is a fertile background for hatred, for xenophobia, for homophobia, for any phobia actually. It is a fertile ground on which you can incite against strangers, against enemies, against anyone who is not you. It is heaven for populists who want to take advantage of people's weaknesses and people's fears and to use it in order to accumulate power, which is being abused and enlarging inequality and enhancing fear, and it becomes a vicious circle from which we have to come out of today. So for me, I think the most important thing that we should take out of COVID is exactly that. Going back to social democracy, going back to a welfare state, going back to a more just division of income and resources, shrinking inequality as much as we possibly can, not allowing people to have models which they see they can never reach and feel deprived and poor and unprivileged in relation to. We have to make sure that the state really does take care of its citizens and its people, that it supplies them the proper welfare, education, health, infrastructure. We all know that this is rewarding. This is something that benefits the economy. This is something that's good for growth and, of course, right now, our most pressing challenge is to create economical prosperous without pollution, without what we used to do in order to enhance growth that brought us this horrible and huge climate crisis that we're facing. We have to tackle the climate crisis. We have to do everything that's so needed in order to deal with it, and at the same time go back to taking care of the people on the basic things that give people the personal, private, family, existential security that is the foundation for democracy.
Thank you very much, Minister, for this very clear explanation. I think it's extremely clear from your words that tackling the climate crisis and promoting welfare is not a trade-off. We have to address both and have an agenda which promotes this simultaneously, and also address the security dimension, which you also stress. Now, let me complete the round of the first interventions with Arantxa Gonzalez, who is with us. And I would like to ask her about the role of international trade, not least because the COVID crisis, the recession also resulted in a disruption of mobility, a disruption of international economic relations. And that also obviously has very high costs. And this makes addressing inequalities, addressing poverty more difficult. And despite these disruptions, we have seen also signs of protectionism and great difficulties of various governments, but also multilateral actors to find the right pathway. Can you help us to find the progressive answer in these circumstances?
Well, thank you very much, first of all, Laszlo, for the invitation to discuss how do we build back better. My starting point will be that what we've learned the hard way with the pandemic is how interdependent we are. And certainly this is the case for international trade. We are now, we saw this during the pandemic, whether it was for people's mobility, whether it was for purchasing and distribution of vaccines, whether it was to feed people during the pandemic, we had to rely largely on international trade. What we are seeing today is that an event somewhere on the value chain of semiconductors, on the logistics and distribution, on the shipping of the goods that come to us has a very big impact. We are seeing how current gluts in international trade is translating into inflation at home. So it matters that we manage this interdependence and that we do this in a cooperative spirit. From this point of view, I think in the area of international trade, progressives need to be able to do two things. I would suggest that firstly, we need to ensure that international trade rules, multilateral trade rules, the institution that represents them, the World Trade Organization, is strengthened. That we build stronger international rules to manage better the highest levels of interdependence that we have today. And we will have a test to do this at the end of this month. The WTO members are meeting for their ministerial conference, and on the agenda they have important decisions to make, from ending subsidies to overfishing that are depleting our oceans. This is a commitment governments took when they signed on to the Sustainable Development Goals. Whether it's to build fairer agricultural trading rules, whether it is to regulate for the first time electronic commerce, this growing part of international trade, and the way we regulate it will matter for the small and medium enterprises, as Howard Lee was telling us a minute ago. Or even taking a commitment to use agenda lens to the international trade rules that we will build. All this is what's on the agenda, and ensuring our trading system is more resilient because we have built rules that are adapted to today's realities would be essential. But the second part of the answer has to do with what governments need to do at home. It's not enough to make trade possible, which is what the World Trade Organization rules would do. This is what makes trade possible. We still need to make trade work. And above all, we need to make sure that trade works for all. And this requires a more resilient social safety nets back home. So as we build greater openness and bigger international rules to manage our independence, we also have to make sure that the rules for the social contract at home is stronger. We need to invest in policies that ensure education and training, in particular technical training and skills building that is up to today's world, not yesterday's world, but what is required today. We need to ensure decent work for all at home. We need to ensure better and fairer taxation systems at home. So I think, Laszlo, the answer is let's build more resilience internationally by fostering greater multilateral cooperation, but let's not forget that part of the success will depend on stronger social safety nets at home too.
Thank you very much, Arantxa, for these points. Trade indeed is crucial, but social safety nets, as you highlighted, cannot be ignored. They should also be strengthened. Look, altogether, after the first round of intervention, we have about 9 minutes left. My suggestion is the following. Why don't we invite all the speakers for a second intervention? Starting with Helen Clark, who might have been a bit shorter than others. So Helen Clark could speak for about 2 minutes, and then everyone else would have another 1 minute intervention to respond to the critical issues which we heard about: sustainable development goals, multilateralism, democracy, welfare states. Helen Clark, the floor is yours.
Well, I think everyone's on the same page that we need an inclusive recovery and we need a sustainable and resilient recovery. This has been a pandemic of inequalities, both at the global level between high-income countries and the low and low-middle-income countries. And at home, it's been a pandemic of inequalities too across our societies. In New Zealand at the moment, we're on the last mile of getting to very high levels of vaccination. But who gets left behind? Indigenous people, people who use drugs, the homeless, those who are in very straitened circumstances. And when we take one-size-fits-all approaches to very important public health campaigns, we inevitably miss people out. And we should have learnt these lessons a long time ago. So I think the watchword going forward is inclusion. We need to address the marginalisation in our societies. We need to make universal health coverage really universal. We need solid social safety nets, the universal basic social protection that Michelle Bachelet's report for Juan Somavia and the ILO talked about all those years ago, and which Arantxa just reinforced. We need good social safety nets. We need to be addressing health inequities. So there's really a big social and economic agenda that comes out of this. And on the sustainable side of the recovery, there was talk from a relatively early stage in the pandemic, coming out of leading business circles like the World Economic Forum in Geneva, that we could have a great reset and it could be a sustainable world going forward. But then I suppose because of the blows to GDP growth, there was a rush back to business as usual. And we don't want to miss the opportunity for doing things differently. You know, in periods of lockdown, we could hear the insects in our suburbs. We could hear the birds sing. They could see the mountains for the first time in Kathmandu, the air quality in Delhi, which is just so bad again that the schools have had to be closed. You know, people actually could breathe in Delhi. So, you know, we saw what the world could be like if we did focus on sustainability and the quality of the environment. The COP conference has just reminded us how important it is to take steps to save our climate ecosystem so it can perform the services for us all that we need. I think that as progressives, we should be ambitious coming out of this. We've got a moment of time, and if we don't seize that moment, that's back into the same bad old ways with economies and societies, leaving people behind and losing the opportunity to really act for sustainability. So that's my message. Seize the moment.
Many thanks, Helen Clark. Speaking to us from New Zealand, Camilla Brückner, with me in the studio. What would be your concluding thoughts after this roundtable?
Well, I'm heavily affected now, speaking just after my former boss, Helen Clark. So I've been well taught, you could say, and I largely agree with many of the things you said. But I've just come from a panel of private sector actors also on discussing sustainability. And when I talk to many partners, there seems to be a large consensus on where we need to go. The UN and UNDP in particular has also done a lot of surveys lately up to the COP, up to other big meetings where we take the temperature, especially on youth, on what they think needs to be done and where we need to go. And again, here we see very big support for many of these measures that are proposed by the Secretary General or others. So we have to ask ourselves, what is it that stops us from making that change? Why is it that we cannot get over this barrier? And why do we get the anti-vaxxers? Why do we get people who feel left behind or left off the general stream of discussions, etc. So I think one of the things that has been mentioned many times in this debate is inclusion and participation. That is absolutely a must. And to reestablish this so-called social contract between governments and institutions and its people, because if we don't have this trust, it will be very difficult to advance these common goals, even though we agree. And this is another factor that we are looking at closely in the UN as well, the whole aspect of behavior. What is it that is needed to change our behavior, even though we believe in where we need to go? What is it that holds us back? So these are some of the things that we need to emphasize and look closer at, and in partnership with as many stakeholders as possible going forward.
Indeed, without participation, inclusion is a theory.
Exactly. So, and I hope we don't need another pandemic to prove to us that this is could be the end game. So we really need to take these steps now.
Okay, Howard Lee from Malaysia, give us a punchline.
On social safety net, or universal solidarity, as I would like to call it, it must be away from this just-in-time mindset, and it has to be everything just in case. On the post-COVID economy, what does it look like? How should it feel like? What should it deliver? It needs to be a human economy that's based on human needs and must put human needs and delivering of human needs front and center of it all. On the SDGs, well, I'd like to mention that someone very powerful once said, man holds in his mortal hands the power to abolish all forms of human poverty and all forms of human life. We need to stop fighting each other. The left, the center left, social democrats needs to come together to make the achievement of the SDGs possible, and the right aren't going to bring us all together. So it is incumbent upon us, the left, to do that. And lastly, the SDGs, according to Jeff Sachs several years ago in Brussels, said does not only stand for Sustainable Development Goals, it also stands for social democratic goals. I long for the day, hopefully before 2030, that it is no longer goals, but the real new norm. That's it. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And last but not least, Arantxa Gonzalez, the floor is yours. Give us a concluding remark from your side.
Well, I want to conclude with the role of the state and the role of governments. and I liked a lot Meraf raising this a minute ago, it's politicians, it's political leaders that need to exercise the leadership today to show that international cooperation is not just a nice set of words, but that they are ready to do it, and they are ready to put more eggs into international cooperation, because this is what protects their people more. So the return of the states, the return of political leadership, and the return of public policies is what I like to see if we are to build this more inclusive, sustainable and resilient future.
Thank you very much. I would like to thank wholeheartedly to all participants of this truly and genuinely global roundtable. This is only the end of the UNitedFor session. This is definitely not the end of the Global Progressive Forum, which continues. So please stay tuned to the forthcoming actions. And in order to facilitate this, of course, colleagues in FEPS, but also in the European Parliament have been working hard. So I also express my appreciation for their work. Thank you all, and wishing you all the best.